There's no definite way to know which superhero came into my life first. I know it was either Superman or Spider-Man, but the race was a photo finish in many ways. I had a Superman blanket and even a Superman Halloween costume, but Superman wasn't as readily accessible for me in media in an early 80s home as yet without a VCR. There was the Super Friends show on Saturday mornings, and that was about it. By comparison, Spider-Man's original cartoon played in the afternoons where I lived, and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends ran on Saturday mornings. It was possible to watch Spider-Man 6 days a week as a kid in the early 80s, even without a VCR. And Spider-Man was certainly my first superhero action figure thanks to Mego Pocket Heroes. Whether he beat the Duke Boys as my very first action figure will likely never be answered. But I wasn't reading comics at that young age. Unbeknownst to me, I was missing out on the real adventures of these heroes. When I finally found an interest in them, G.I. Joe was the gateway title for me in 1987. So there I was, collecting Marvel's G.I. Joe in the late 80s, having long forgotten about my early childhood friendship with superheroes. Then a monkey wrench was thrown into my comics collecting journey. Our family moved to England in 1990. People drove on the other side of the car, on the other side of the road. The comic book scene was totally different, and G.I. Joe wasn't even a thing over there. Little did I know this would lead me right back into the web of Spider-Man for the first time in almost a decade, and result in my first and most unique superhero comic experience.
Spider-Man!
No, I'm trying to help. Let me help you.
In America, at the beginning of the 1990s, you could get mainstream comics almost everywhere. Besides the dedicated comic shops, almost every drugstore, grocery store, and bookstore at the shopping mall had a spinner rack of Marvel and DC comics. In England in 1990, dedicated comic shops weren't as prevalent, and the actual comics landscape itself was completely different. The British comics publishing industry was a totally unique animal when compared to the United States. For example, British publishers were releasing Action Force comics, not G.I. Joe, and the contents inside were a combination of reprinted G.I. Joe issues with lettering changes to refer to Action Force instead of the G.I. Joe moniker, as well as new original stories specific to the Action Force comics. The physical format of the Action Force comics was far larger than the American G.I. Joe comics. A tabloid magazine size with floppier pages, as this was the common publishing format for most British comics at that time. When we arrived in 1990, newsagents and grocery stores were stocking the mega-popular Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. Yes, I said Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. The comic was a larger format printing like all British comics, and they released a new issue every 2 weeks. Published by Fleetway, these were reprints of Archie Comics' popular Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles adventures in the United States. You might be wondering why Archie didn't publish its own comics in Britain, but this practice wasn't uncommon. In 1991, a publisher called Trident Comics reprinted 3 issues of Dark Horse Comics' Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis series before ending the title without much warning right before the 4th and last issue in the story, much to my frustration as a teenager. Dark Horse made the decision to publish their own material in Britain after the situation with Trident, and in 1992 released 10 issues of Star Wars, reprinting the Dark Empire series and the first 4 issues of classic Star Wars before ending their own UK print run, while also reprinting the Indiana Jones stories as a supplement within each issue. Of course, I was fated to move away from England in the summer of 1993, just prior to the release of the last issue in that series. At the same time, I would often find different newsagents selling small handfuls of American comics right alongside British format titles. For example, one newsagent carried Savage Sword of Conan, which I picked up anytime I could find it. Occasionally, you'd find popular Marvel and DC books as well, but it was always random chance. There was no certainty a title would stay stocked consistently from one month to the next. With that somewhat chaotic environment surrounding my comic book choices at the time, I can't remember what exactly compelled me to reach for the Amazing Spider-Man number 343, Web of Spider-Man 72, and Spectacular Spider-Man 172. I'd never read a superhero comic, nor had much of an interest due to a prolonged focus on Star Wars and G.I. Joe. I can only assume I was compelled to pick them up after I saw the Toy Biz Spider-Man figure and bought him out of a sense of nostalgia for my old Mego figure. Maybe that put Spider-Man back in my brain. Who knows? Anyway, these 3 issues were at the newsagent alongside a curious 4th Spider-Man title. Not the recently launched Spider-Man penned by rising star Todd McFarlane. This was something called The Complete Spider-Man, and it was a Marvel UK publication. Specifically, this was issue number 4. Marvel UK, the publisher of the aforementioned Action Force, was behind the title, and had a long history publishing Spider-Man comics in Great Britain, starting with Spider-Man Comics Weekly in 1973. The comic ran until 1985, and changed titles 12 times, even carrying the name Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends for a brief stint. In 1986, Marvel UK relaunched Spider-Man comics with Spider-Man and Zoids, which has to be one of the weirdest combos ever to grace a comic book cover. This weekly comic was comprised of further Spider-Man comic reprints alongside new Zoid stories. In the tradition of British comics, this was also a tabloid magazine format book like its predecessor. Then in late 1990, mere months after my family arrived in England, Marvel UK launched The Complete Spider-Man, seemingly as a response to the highly successful premiere of McFarlane's Spider-Man comic series. The Complete Spider-Man's first issue reprinted McFarlane's first issue, as well as 3 issues of the other Spider-Man comic titles. However, even though Spider-Man number 1 was an August 1990 book, the other 3 titles reprinted inside weren't from the same month. Amazing Spider-Man 330 and Web of Spider-Man 62 were from March. Spectacular 161 was from February. Likely this was done so that each comic inside wouldn't start in the middle of a story arc, because in the August 1990 issues of the other titles, Spider-Man was in the middle of the Return of the Sinister Six in Amazing Spider-Man, in the final issue of his battle with Night and Fog in Spectacular Spider-Man, and discovering Harry Osborn's want to be a hero in Web of Spider-Man. In order to avoid confusion, for the first 11 or so issues, the reprinted covers inside each issue deleted the actual issue numbers and the month of release. Each issue would also pick a cover from one of the comics reprinted inside and use that as its front cover, which meant that only 3 issues inside began with their covers. Sometimes the page count was so tight, the final page of the last issue was reprinted on the inside back cover. With that first issue of Complete Spider-Man, lucky buyers even got a free Spider-Man jacket patch. Occasionally, they would even have free Spider-Man posters at the center of each issue. And yes, I removed them and put them on my walls, and they disappeared long ago. And there was one more unique aspect to Complete Spider-Man. Marvel UK made the uncommon decision to publish this title in the American comic size format, not the more traditional magazine size as had been the case with its predecessor, Spider-Man and Zoids, and pretty much every British comic up until that point. Generally, reprint titles don't get a lot of attention or respect from collectors, and I understand why. Looking at a title like Complete Spider-Man through the eyes of someone who read comics in the United States and is now an adult collector, this probably seems like a weird format for the superhero. And it is. However, if you lived in England during that time, The Complete Spider-Man was a huge relief to a kid reading Spider-Man comics. Each issue was guaranteed to provide books from all 4 titles in the proper story sequence month to month. It was consistently more readily available than the single American issues because it was a Marvel UK book, and the publication also ran without any ad pages, which was really nice. The book had charming quirks. As a book for younger readers, the Brits made sure instances of American spellings were changed to British spellings to avoid confusion. Whenever possible, editors would make sure dialogue references were edited to refer back to previous issues of The Complete Spider-Man. But occasionally the characters were referencing events before The Complete Spider-Man began publishing, so Marvel UK had to leave in the original footnotes. Every issue presented the books in the order of Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, and Web of Spider-Man. And Marvel UK even made sure their cover had a left corner Spider-Man that was unique from all 4 of the American title Spider-Man icons. The early 90s were also the final analog years of comics, when stories still lived on that less expensive paper, so even the pages had life embedded in them. Through a myriad of microscopic imperfections in each panel, both in the paper and the printing, the eye was activated in a way that has been lost now, unless you had a copy with a major printing error. The Complete Spider-Man's format did have a few notable drawbacks. For one, it was months behind the actual issues, with each title staggered differently from the starting line of issue number 1. That meant on several occasions I would pick up a copy of Complete Spider-Man and discover I already owned one or two of the issues inside when I'd found the American comics here and there at newsagents. Secondly, despite starting with fresh story arcs for each title at the beginning of the first issue, some previous stories' events carried over so heavily, it was a bit frustrating having no way of knowing exactly what had happened. The most pronounced example of this was a subplot in which Mary Jane had been kidnapped by some crazy stalker prior to the launch of the Complete Spider-Man, and her kidnapper had been released from prison. So this situation we're not all that familiar with hangs on through almost half of the Complete Spider-Man's run. Despite what I just said, a big advantage to reading The Complete Spider-Man was it resulted in mitigating the intimidation one feels when jumping into a big legacy comic like Spider-Man. The character had been around for almost 30 years at that point, with multiple titles and hundreds of issues to his name. Having a Spider-Man book that said, "We're gonna give you all 4 titles each month, and we're starting you off in issue number 1 at the beginning of 4 story arcs," meant anyone who picked this up wasn't going to be totally confused. Aside from that Mary Jane subplot hanging on in the wings, as well as a few characters you'd probably never heard of, I found I was up to speed pretty quickly despite having started with issue number 4. In the background, I confess I was a little overwhelmed by being a new reader of The Amazing Spider-Man in the mid-300s, but all of that worry went away with issue 344. This was the introduction of the villain Cardiac, and it was proudly declared on the cover. While Cardiac never became a popular villain like Venom, what this issue did for me as a comics reader was truly profound. This issue, and Cardiac as a character, brought me instantly to the realization that just because I was a new reader in the mid-300s, that didn't mean I was late to everything. Here was a new villain that Spider-Man was facing for the first time, and I was there to witness it alongside all the other longtime Spider-Man fans. Cardiac's introduction reversed all concern I had for not having a comic from the first issue. In fact, it made me feel like I was now part of a long tradition in comics. I was witness to an event in this extensive history when it happened. That's when I fell in love with high-numbered titles. And to this day, I get ticked off when marketing schlubs at these companies reset the numbering to 1 for these heroes over and over. Sadly, Cardiac has never been graced with a Marvel Legends action figure, despite the efforts of friend and fellow fan of this era of Spider-Man, Bobby Valla, during his time at Hasbro. The biggest appeal of The Complete Spider-Man was the value. For under £2, you received 100 pages of Spider-Man adventures. You really couldn't beat that. And not only were you getting a lot of pennies for your pound, the publication run of The Complete Spider-Man, by pure chance, coincided with one of the most stellar eras of Spider-Man comics of all time. But I was just becoming a teenager when these comics were being published, so I had no idea how well regarded many of the artists and stories from this run would become. All I knew was I was kicking myself for having not read Spider-Man comics sooner. This was not only the era of Todd McFarlane, but also the incredibly kinetic work of Eric Larson and the iconic artwork of Alex Saviuk. As much as people gush over McFarlane, I always found his artwork to be somewhat inaccessible. The human faces looked more like a spitting image episode than real people, and he seemed more at home doing hyper-detailed horror imagery with minimal writing than actual comic book storytelling. A lot of McFarlane's splash pages are images I still have a hard time making out exactly what I'm looking at.
Remember, relax your eyes.
In a strange twist of fate, my very first comic book was G.I. Joe number 61, an issue that I would learn much later in life had originally been drawn by McFarlane, but his artwork was rejected and the issue was redrawn prior to publication. While I still read and enjoy the McFarlane stories for the most part, I was far more a fan of Larson and Saviuk. Larson's art has an energy to it that is hard to describe. The characters really come alive in a comic action kind of way without being difficult to interpret. Meanwhile, Saviuk's art represented what I felt even at 13 was the quintessential look for all of the Spider-Man characters. Peter Parker and Mary Jane had a clean, crisp, classic style to them with each panel. He drew them in a way that made you feel as if they'd always been drawn that way, and he was honoring the artists that had come before him. If Spider-Man's cast had been brought into the Superpowers action figure figure line, I feel they would have looked like Saviuk's renderings of the characters. Spectacular Spider-Man Sal Buscema was the outlier. This is going to sound like sacrilege given his legendary status drawing Marvel books in the 1970s, but his artwork on Spectacular Spider-Man is shockingly minimalist in its style when placed up against the other three titles. And with the format provided by the Complete Spider-Man, that comparison is made even more brutal when you turn from the last page of Larson's work into Buscema's first pages each month. The brain and eyes take a gut punch every time. I'm not sure what the situation was, but Buscema appears to have done his own inking, and by that I mean barely to not at all.
Somebody draws something and then draw the exact same thing, like right on top of it. What do you call it?
I don't know, man. Tracing?
See?
No shadows, next to no detail, and a style that looks more at home in a cartoon from the 1960s than a comic book in the 1990s. Where McFarlane overdrew, Buscema's simplicity is the other end of the spectrum during this era of Spider-Man. It being the early 90s, the artwork in these Spider-Man stories was unashamedly glamorous. Spider-Man was a geek's hero for having to navigate the affections and advances of multiple gorgeous women, with his wife Mary Jane drawn to erotic levels of exaggeration. The hair was big, the busts were buxom, and it was always a little too cold, apparently.
She makes me feel kind of funny. Like when we used to climb the rope in gym class.
We never really tackled stuff like that in the old days. I mean, what with the comic book code and all.
What?
More than that, though, the Complete Spider-Man bottled a very important transitional period in the history of the Spider-Man comic. McFarlane's revolutionary work on The Amazing Spider-Man in the years prior had changed the entire visual style of all the Spider-Man comics. Plus, it earned him the esteemed privilege of launching a brand new Spider-Man book all his own, which, frankly, feels more like an avant-garde horror comic than a Spider-Man comic. The book feels more like McFarlane's testing ground for Spawn, and how it even carried a Comics Code Authority approval baffles me. Throughout the 24-issue run of Complete Spider-Man, readers were witness to McFarlane's eventual transition out of Spider-Man, some of the best work by Larson, including his gradual double duty on Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man, before leaving himself with Amazing Spider-Man 350. In an odd move, Marvel UK opted to print both Amazing Spider-Man 350 and 351 in Complete Spider-Man 21, delaying Web of Spider-Man 82 until the next issue, the only time the publication would omit one of Spider-Man's monthly titles. The Amazing Spider-Man 351 would see the beginning of artist Mark Bagley's legendary run on the character, capping off a trifecta of Spider-Man artists on the Amazing Spider-Man title that is arguably as successful and iconic an era as the trio that succeeded Spider-Man's original artist Steve Ditko, John Romita Sr., Gil Kane, and Ross Andru. Beyond the now legendary artists, the Complete Spider-Man also bottled a bridge for the character between two epic events. Just before the publication of The Complete Spider-Man, Peter Parker had experienced the acquisition of Captain Universe's vast powers. The Complete Spider-Man picks up shortly after Peter Parker's powers have returned to normal, and the book's run ends almost 24 issues before the all-encompassing crossover event Maximum Carnage, who doesn't even make an appearance in the pages of Complete Spider-Man, as we've only just met Cletus Cassidy. What I'm saying is, as a kid who only knew Spider-Man from his cartoons and his general storyline, had the Complete Spider-Man started the story earlier or later, I would have been thrown into an unrecognizable world based on what I knew Spider-Man to be. As luck would have it, I was in a period where the stories were very grounded again. No cosmic forays, no multi-dimensional hijinks, and very little magic. These were years of classic-style Spider-Man tales. I recognized the core elements of what I knew Spider-Man to be: the Daily Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson, Aunt May, Mary Jane Watson, now Peter Parker's wife, of course, and all of his classic villains made regular appearances as well. Doc Ock, Electro, Mysterio, Sandman, Vulture, Kingpin, Lizard, Scorpion, Shocker, Green Goblin, and Hobgoblin. The Avengers, Wolverine, Punisher, and Ghost Rider teamed up with him during this period as well. Because all of those iconic elements anchored the issues during this run, I think that made it easier to get to know the characters I wasn't familiar with, like Venom, Black Cat, Silver Sable, Tombstone, Cardiac, and Puma, amongst others. Which was perfect timing because it meant upon my very first encounter with the Spider-Man arcade game, I knew who Venom and Black Cat were right off the bat. The storylines ranged from Spider-Man's conflict with Puma, the return of the Sinister Six, and rather quickly after that, the revenge of the Sinister Six, Peter trying to stop Harry Osborn from becoming the Green Goblin again, Venom breaking Eddie Brock out of prison to kill Spider-Man once and for all, Felicia Hardy's jealousy of Peter's marriage to Mary Jane, the hunt for a child murderer in the forests of Canada, Spider-Man accidentally given Hulk's powers for a few issues, Mary Jane dealing with a stalker and warding off the advances of a determined Lothario, hunting escaped Nazis with Silver Sable, and even Spider-Man attempting to give up his powers to live a normal life for Mary Jane and Aunt May. There was also that story where Spider-Man and the Avengers have to fight something he calls a swarm. Yeah, I know. And I know you're waiting for it. So let's just get the joke over with.
Everyone will work for Swarm. Everyone! Everyone!
And let's not forget that story about the accidental creation of a superhuman named Corona that ended up giving everyone in New York a high-fevered illness of some kind. I'm not making this up. That actually happened. Spider-Man of the early 90s predicted coronavirus almost 30 years ago, people. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Web of Spider-Man issue 75, because in this issue, Spider-Man, for the first time in the actual Marvel Universe, meets Firestar. And I don't have to tell you what a thrill that was for people in our age group.
Hey, Firestar! I think I know how to beat the Shocker!
The Complete Spider-Man ended up being such a unique and treasured primer for my introduction to legacy superhero comics. I didn't manage to get every issue. Nowhere close, in fact. I was splitting my allowance between Spider-Man comics and Star Wars role-playing game sourcebooks. However, that didn't blunt my disappointment when I learned The Complete Spider-Man had been cancelled and replaced with the retitled Exploits of Spider-Man. Now back to the larger tabloid magazine dimensions, and with its first issue omitting the Spider-Man monthly title altogether in favor of a reprinting of Amazing Fantasy 15. Sadly, The Complete Spider-Man didn't end the way it had commenced. The final issue was filled with unfinished tales. An Infinity War crossover, Amazing Spider-Man in a part 2 of 6, Web of Spider-Man kicking off their first part of a 6-part story, and Spider-Man trying to stop Harry Osborn once again. At that point, I put Spider-Man comics on hold until returning to the United States in the summer of 1993, where I eagerly jumped back into all the Spider-Man books, but learned in my hiatus I'd missed the entire Maximum Carnage crossover. It wasn't long after that the Marvel brass wrecked Spider-Man for a long time with the Clone Saga and Ben Reilly. They even changed the logos on the book covers for the first time to reflect the new animated cartoon. I found the story so disappointing I bailed very early on into it and never picked up a current Spider-Man book again. I did take notice of the launch of the 1994 Spider-Man animated series, as it seemed to be taking a lot of inspiration from the comics era I had been familiar with. And little wonder, given how successful Spider-Man comics had been during that period before the Clone Saga broke everything. In the many years since, Spider-Man has remained present in all of our lives through the regular cartoon and live-action film productions. I've collected a number of the Amazing Spider-Man omnibus volumes, as well as a slew of action figures. But I think my most prized Spider-Man possession is a worn stack of 24 comic books I've managed to finally pull together from British shores. Most people I talk to have never heard of The Complete Spider-Man, and reprint titles like these don't hold a lot of interest for serious comic collectors. For me, though, this is how I learned what Spider-Man was really all about. Not from a cartoon, not from a movie, but the actual source material, before titles were reset to #1, and decades before Spider-Man inexplicably became the mascot character for Marvel Multiverse tales. Issue after issue of Spider-Man just doing what he does best, making the neighborhood friendlier.